How's everybody doing? It's a good, very good cheer. Welcome back to the SDG Action Zone. We are so lucky because in advance of the SDG Summit, which launches in just a few minutes at 3 o'clock, we get to actually chat with two of our wonderful SDG advocates. And that's been one of the highlights of the SDG Action Zone, is how many events we've been able to do with these wonderful change makers. And with that, let me introduce them. She's an expert in indigenous peoples' adaptation to climate change, traditional ecological knowledge, and climate change mitigation strategies. Huge round of applause for Hindu Ibrahim. And he's an award-winning humanitarian activist who aspires to be the first physically disabled person to travel into space. Eddie Ndopu. So you guys, the SDG Summit kicks off at 3 o'clock. We are going to have the live feed in here. What are you looking forward to when you head in there?
Well, I'm looking forward to the possibility of greater ambition. I think that decision makers now are really charged with the responsibility to double down on the commitments that were made in 2015. And as we approach...
People in the back, I want silence. Straight away. Great. Perfect. Thank you. Eddie, start over.
I'm looking for greater ambition. And as we approach the year for the Decade of Action, I think that we are presented with an opportunity to be really more intersectional in the way that we think about the SDGs. You know, I'm often asked, oh, what SDG do you work on? And I think that that's the incorrect question, because we know that it's a universal agenda. We know that it's indivisible. And therefore, we need to be thinking about the goals as being interrelated. So I'm really hoping that, you know, the public policy-making process, as we move into the next decade, will really resist the temptation to compartmentalize and to recognize that everything is interconnected. So when we talk about climate action, we need to speak about gender. When we speak about gender, we need to be speaking about education. And so I think that's the challenge. And so I'm really hoping that the discourse will become more intersectional.
And what about you, Hindu?
Yeah, actually, my brother said it well. We don't want them to come and say, I'm working well in education or I'm working well in health. No, they have to come and change the discourse. How they are implementing the 17 SDGs goal together, how they are interlinkages, and how they can move from the discourse that as head of state, they always usually use it for campaign. Like just to know the message is here, but they come with a cameraman from home who filming them, and then the message is not passing for the reality, but passing for the purpose of beyond here, just like for them future power. So if they can just think about SDG, it's not about the power. SDG is not about the money. SDG is about the future of peoples and futures of our peoples here, of the peoples with disability, of the women, children, indigenous communities. So they have to think about that and then give a reality of what they can do back home, what they cannot do. And as SDG Advocates, we are there to support what they cannot do, to make it happen, because it's our future all together.
And actually, I love that you mentioned what they can't do, because we all know that amazing work happens here, not just at the UN, but at all the people that are invited into the UN every year. And yet the message never really percolates out, right? We don't often get to hear about it in the ways that we should, and it often doesn't go as far as it should or could in order to make the change we so desperately need. So I wonder how you see your roles as advocates in adding dimension to that. Is there more that you can do and share and work on to kind of amplify these messages and push us farther than maybe we're often able to go?
Absolutely. And I think that we need to be very honest.
Say it again, Eddie.
We need to be very honest. We have to be honest. There is a profound lack of representation. When we speak about leaving nobody behind, it's not because we want to feel good. It's not a kumbaya thing. It is a moral and political imperative to ensure that the most marginalized communities are at the decision-making table. It's not enough. And I think that it is truly unacceptable. This morning, I looked around as I was in the General Assembly chamber. I looked around and I had this out-of-body experience because I recognized that I was the only wheelchair user in the entire hall. And a part of me, I could cry because, you know, there are 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world, 15% of the world's total population. And here we are in the most powerful room on the face of the earth. And the people whose voices need to be amplified are not in the room. And the same thing could be said for women along the lines of gender. The same thing could be said for indigenous people. So I think it's time that we actually really put our money where our mouths are and recognize that if we are serious about delivering on the mandates of the Sustainable Development Goals, then it's not enough to say leaving nobody behind as a slogan, but it's about saying that those in power need to step aside and give way for leaders from vulnerable segments of society to lead and usher all of us into the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
And Hindu, just what you said just now is more than we often hear from leaders. So how do you see this role? How are you able to kind of translate what's happening here to amplify it, but also to force it to evolve and to come into the 21st century with us?
So as SDG advocate, I think we get also an opportunity. We can meet this head of state because we can be with them in the same room.
Yeah.
It's not the case of all indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
Do you know for all this General Assembly how many indigenous people get passes? 4.
Oh my God. Say that again.
4 peoples only get passes for this SDG here in New York. We negotiate very hard to get them. There are how many come here in New York? They left them home miles and miles to be here, but they can't get in the room. Just to be as observer in the room, they get 4 passes to sit in the back and just listen from what they're saying. So you see how access is very difficult. And then there are more than 400 million indigenous peoples around the world, those who are carrying the solutions. But as one of indigenous person and SDG advocate, they have this obligation to get me and see me in the room with them. So what I did, just the day before yesterday, my president come here. He catch me, he say, he need to discuss with me. I sit down discussing with him, I'm like, listen, I'm not there to tell you excellencies or whatever. I'm there to fight for the peoples who didn't get the voice. And let me tell you, I'm coming from a nomadic communities, and it's still to now, my community do not have a birth certificate, who must be the first document every human being must get. They don't have it. And what he said like, well, you are a nomadic, you know, you are between all those countries. So this is not the most important. I'm like, wait a minute. I just stopped him and, wait a minute. Do you think it's not important? How can we go to the school if we don't have a birth certificate? How we can vote if we don't have a birth certificate? How we can go to the hospital? And then immediately he reflected back, and then he promised we can work in a plan to 2 pilot school for those communities. So that's how I can use concretely being an SDG advocate to approach those world leaders, to tell them the realities, the truths, to make them change them a strategy. It's not always through the ministries that things can happen, not always through the UN agencies that things can happen. It's by involving the communities that know them realities, who can help them to change. They want to be a good leaders, we are there to guide them, to make them a good leaders. They want to help the communities, we are there. If they don't want to do it, we are an SDG advocate to do it in their place.
Yeah. And you can do it because you're here. I am so excited to welcome our 3rd SDG advocate with just a few minutes to go before all 3 of our folks have to head over to the SDG Summit. Let me give you a proper introduction, Highness. He's focused on peace, public health, girl-child education advocacy, Job Creation and Reforms of Muslim Family Law, the 14th Emir of Kano, Mohammed Sanusi II. And just to bring you up to speed on our conversation, we were chatting a bit about how there's such a wonderful work that happens here, but it doesn't always translate out into the world. And we wondered, how does the role that you all as SDG advocates play allow you to add dimension to that conversation? What are you able to amplify and change, and what do you look forward to being able to do in this role?
Well, first of all, I thank you very much for having me on this panel, and apologies for coming late also at another event. Now, if I can use that event as a base, that was a Nigeria side event that had the president and the governors and ministers. And obviously, the governments have a key role to play in SDGs. It's about a whole mindset, a new orientation, moving from being, in many of African states, basically rent-seeking states to developmental states. And for us, I think being able to engage with those in government and being able to influence the direction of policy is critical. Now, in my role as a traditional religious leader, I also find that I have to influence attitudes. I mean, sometimes it's not about money. Okay, so if you talk about northern Nigeria and the levels of poverty, you've also got to look at how people relate with the environment. You've got to look at how people think about demographic growth. You've got a rapid increase in the population due to very high fertility rates, due to family structures where most men tend to be polygynous, whether or not they can afford to maintain families. And these are cultural issues. You don't fix that by throwing money at these problems. Absolutely. You've got to deal with people's attitude towards the education of their daughters. How long do girls stay in school? How many children should you have per woman? How do you focus on quality rather than quantity? And how do people try to manage the size of their family to the kind of budgets that they have so that they don't keep throwing people into poverty? I think for me, this is the dual role I have, coming from a previous background as a public officer, central bank governor. I'm able to talk to people in government, the ministers and the president, but also being a traditional role, I'm able to discuss with religious leaders and with the people on the ground and see how we can change attitudes. That's the role I...
But it does require cultural understanding, to the point that we were all making earlier, which is that you, in order to shift attitudes rather than throwing money at the problem, you actually have to understand where those attitudes come from.
Yes, and also I think a certain degree of empathy and a certain degree of humility. So I'll give you an example.
Say those again, please. Empathy and humility. Because we need that here all the time.
So let me give you an example. When we started writing and trying to codify Muslim family law, one of the greatest areas of resistance was on fixing the age of marriage. Okay, now I started this with this whole attitude: we're going to have a minimum age of 18 for marriage of girls, because that's what we had. Okay, and there's a lot of resistance. And initially, I had the typical elite attitude that these are people who simply don't want to understand, you know, and they're backward and they're primitive. And then you begin to talk to them, and they say, okay, so you tell a man in a rural village not to marry off his daughter until she's 18, but you don't have a school in the village.
Exactly.
Okay, so what does the girl do until the age of 18? You don't have a school, you don't have jobs, you have made no arrangements for her life up to the age of 18, and you say you want a minimum age of 18. And then you begin to realize that maybe we have been blaming the victims. Maybe we've been assuming that people don't want to send their girls to school. When we've not built the schools, we've not sent the teachers. How do you assume that someone does not want to educate his daughter if she does not have access to education?
Absolutely.
So maybe it's not a demand problem, but a supply problem. And all of a sudden you begin to focus and say, okay, look, instead of talking about a minimum age of 18, why don't we talk about providing education for all girls up to the age of 18? And then...
You can clap for that. You can clap for that.
and that immediately shifts the burden of responsibility from the poor person who has not been given a school and a teacher to the political authorities who were supposed to provide the schools and the teachers. And that becomes an uncomfortable conversation immediately, because then people realize that they have actually, it's the failure of governance rather than a cultural issue. So that's just one example. And then, and obviously if you deal with that, then you wouldn't be talking about child brides, because all girls will be in school by the time they finish their 18. And then you deal with so many of the SDGs, because you deal with empowerment of women, you deal with fertility rates and demographic growth. You deal with out-of-school children because education becomes intergenerational. You know, you deal with poverty because you're able to earn a living, and you can count the number of SDGs that will be impacted by that simple exercise of investing in the education of a girl child up to senior secondary school. And that for me that's why it's the main SDG that I'm pushing.
Absolutely, and that's why we're so happy you're here. But an uncomfortable conversation is a good conversation, and I think we forget that here sometimes. It is important to have uncomfortable conversations, and we're glad that all three of you seem so willing to do that, because that's how we can be sure that some changes might actually happen around here and in the world. I want to just, because we only have a few minutes left, I want to just hear from each of you, what is your hope for this SDG Summit and beyond? Because you're all new to this role, a little newish. And I want to hear what you're looking forward to this afternoon and tomorrow, but also in this role as you move forward. Eddie, why don't we start with you?
Right, so I think I'll underscore what His Highness said earlier about empathy. I think that, you know, we rattle off all of these statistics. 90% of children with disabilities have never seen the inside of a classroom across the global south. But behind each of these devastating statistics are human beings with aspirations, with dreams, with fears, with anxieties. They're full human beings, right? So I think in so many ways we need to really flip Maslow's hierarchy and really accord people dignity and self-actualization, that is just as important as housing and the basic building blocks to life. So it really is about looking at people in the totality of their humanity and really affirming that in a very meaningful way. So my hope for the summit and for my role over the next little while will be to really humanize, but really affirm and accord self-actualization to the most vulnerable and neglected segments of society.
I always love you. I always love what you're saying, because this is really what we are expecting all. I hope that they realize 10 years is nothing. 10 years is about tomorrow. 10 years is not a future. 10 years is the present. And this present is starting now. It's starting from the 3 p.m. today at the General Assembly, where they have to live with concrete action plan, not speech, not discourse, not commitment, but action plan, where they can implement all the SDGs at their country home. How they can localize the SDGs by leaving no one behind. How they can give the voice of those who are left for centuries, but who are there to help them to make the SDGs happen. They have to understand we don't have time and we don't have any excuse, because they have everything they want in their hand. They have peoples, they have technology, they have traditional knowledge, they have the brains to work on it. If it is man who make the problem, man must think about the solutions. So they have to show us how much they are smart. And I'm so curious to see how they are smart. If they are not, we will be more smart than them.
Yeah, we're glad you're going to be there for that reason.
Well, I'd like to see, in three simple words, I'd like to see responsibility, I'd like to see optimism and realism. Now, when I say responsibility, I think it's important for African leaders in particular to understand that the SDGs, really, the UN is just telling you what you're supposed to be doing. I don't think it's something that you think of as pushing through a UN agenda. I mean, it's your job to deal with poverty. It's your job to deal with health. It's your job to deal with education. It's your job to deal with the environment. So the reality is, if you look at China in the 1970s, it was Deng who started the opening. This was long before the MDGs and the SDGs. He was concerned that there were 700 million Chinese living in poverty, and he felt that this was not what he was supposed to be, the state was supposed to be governing over. So that's the first responsibility. Second is optimism. You look at what China has done in 40 years, lifting 670 million people out of poverty between 1974 and now. Okay, putting in so many universities that you've moved from just 8 million graduates to 300 million graduates in 40 years, more than the population of the United States. So the sense that in our lifetimes, we have seen one country do that, move from the center of poverty in the world to the second biggest economy in the world in 40 years, should give us hope. Okay, I mean, the Chinese are human beings; they're not angels or people. I mean, they did it, so we should be able to do that. The third is realism, which is to understand that this is really not theoretical. Okay, if you look at the problems of Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria, you've got to look at what happened to the Chad Basin. If you look at the problems between herdsmen and farmers, you've got to look at the conflict over land and water resources that have been shrinking, and the demographic explosion. You look at the Niger Delta issues, look at what the oil industry has done to the environment in the Niger Delta. So climate change, these are not theoretical conversations in New York. They're leading to real conflict on the ground in Africa, and we're looking for sources in ethnic and religious differences rather than in the real source, which is really about the environment, about sustainability, about the struggle for resources. And therefore, we've got to realize that we have to deal with it as an existential issue rather than something that is about political correctness.
Absolutely. And perspective is power. I think you've seen that here, having your perspective, having yours, having the perspective of information even, and the long view of history is so powerful, and we don't do that enough. So I just have to say on behalf of all of us, and just using the three of you as an example, I'm so glad to have this SDG class of advocates, of SDG advocates and alumni, and we're super excited to just send you off with all our best wishes and our hopes. Not to put too much pressure on you. So let's let them go because they've got work to do. Thank you, thank you, thank you to His Highness, the Emir of Kano, to Hindu Ibrahim, and to Eddie Ndopu.
Thank you.
And just so you all know, we are going to be live streaming the launch of the SDG Summit, so we'll see you all in there. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, yes, of course. It was wonderful.
Your Highness, thank you so much.